A targeted rate suspension item, and I welcome to the table Andrew Duncan.
Good morning. This report's recommending that we continue our spending on visitor attraction and major events, but at a lower level than had been planned previously, and that we reinstate the accommodation provider targeted rate from the 1st of July 2022. And we think this is the best trade-off between the value we get from investing in visitor attraction and major events, particularly in terms of the latent demand it generates and from the events we can attract to the city in the future. Noting that the sector has indicated, given the position they're in, that this is not a priority for them right at present. And the current business position of accommodation providers that you can see in the data in this report, and that's been indicated by both them and the general public in the feedback. And of course, the remaining spending that we're proposing for next year is funded by general rates. And as you've been discussing, the general rate spending is constrained and has many other demands. So we think the recommendation to reduce the spending and reinstate the rate on the 1st of July 2022 is the appropriate trade-off to make in these circumstances. This recommendation supported, we've worked this up with Auckland Unlimited, and they support it. Because the decision last year didn't coincide with a rating year, the rate was due to start again on the 1st of April, and the invoices would be payable in the fourth quarter of this year. It's coming up to the time when those invoices will go out. So our recommendation to you today to implement a reinstatement on the 1st of July 2022 asks you to first agree that we remit the fourth quarter invoice for this year. And the second part of the recommendation is on the spending for next year and the rate for next year, which will be a recommendation to the governing body on the 25th of May, where they'll take the recommendation from this committee on this issue alongside the recommendations on the remainder of the LTP that will be made by this committee on the 25th of May. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, I remind you that we had a workshop on this for a reason, and everybody should have asked all the questions that they've had, but I will formally ask if there are any questions. No? Yes, Councillor?
So I've got a question as it goes to the suspension of the accommodation provider targeted rate. Effectively, that decision is around still having the accommodation targeted rate, but pushing it out further. And given that we've had COVID over the intervening period when we first introduced this targeted rate, and we've got a quite different circumstance where we've got hotels, for example, that are being used for quarantine purposes and the like. They're not the standard accommodation that we would envisage for tourists. Is the present accommodation provider targeted rate fit for purpose in that respect? I mean, is it can it actually deal with the changed circumstance that we have now?
Yes, it can. So when we come back to you in November for the annual plan for 2022-23, when you'll have the opportunity to consider the accommodation and tourism business environment again, in regard to the application of this rate for that year, we'll be able to advise you on exactly how we would manage those circumstances for hotels so that they're rated fairly, where they're providing MIQ services as well, if we're still unfortunate enough to think that we'll be in that position in 12 months' time. So we can definitely deal with that. We can deal with it now as well, but the rate's not going to apply under this recommendation.
A related question, and it goes to obviously the work between now and November. Will we also be informing ourselves around the progress around any form of bed tax or the like, so that it informs the later process?
Can I suggest we don't answer that question under
Yes,
the
Councillor.
basis of current court considerations?
Thank you. Right, no further questions. I'll open for comments. Any comments? Councillor Darby.
Thanks. Look, I understand the pressure here, and we've got to be careful because we do have the case live. But I guess what concerns me here, and I did articulate this in some questions in yesterday's workshop, is that we're actually stalling the exposure of Auckland here. A lot of New Zealanders would have greater visibility of a tourism option into Tasmania than they do have as opposed to a tourism option into Auckland at the moment. And when you're not in the market promoting your city because you don't have the budget, you do fall behind. So this motion actually is going to have us fall behind, unfortunately, and I think we need to be we need to realise that. We're out of the market. We're out of the market at the moment. We're not priming the market with who we are. We're not reminding the tourist market that we are a city worth visiting. We're relying on Tourism New Zealand, and of course, they're not giving us much focus. They're giving us that focus to the regions. We are not being well represented by Tourism New Zealand at the moment, and that is the blunt, honest truth of it. So without that, and without this, we are really well and truly in neutral. And this is going, when we do get this budget back, or something in place whereby we can promote Tāmaki Makaurau, we are going to be coming, our starting point is going to be a long way back in the field, of competitor cities who are trying to grab attention from the new tourism market that will emerge. But that is going to be quite a challenge. So I would imagine even if we do start collecting some kind of revenue next year, the product of that revenue is probably not going to show up for at least 6 to 12 months. So it's a long way out. There are some big risks in this, and I just hope that the tourism industry that has been lobbying hard for such a collection regime to not be in place is aware of the risks to it by their advocacy.
Thank you, Councillor. I should have called for a mover and a seconder for this. I've got a mover in Member Taiperi and a seconder in the Deputy Chair. Thank you, Councillor. Sorry. Thank you. Councillor, comment now from Councillor Watson.
Thank you. I think it's perhaps worth noting that these recommendations are in fact what the accommodation providers asked for, and particularly the commercial accommodation providers in the long-term plan consultation. It's pretty much verbatim what they're requesting. The only thing that they added to that was that there'll be some sort of review of how this rate is operating as a whole. And I think it's important to understand where they're coming from, because basically their request is prompted by this desire to survive, and that's, might sound a bit dramatic, but that's essentially the position they're in, particularly the kind of small accommodation provider that's out in the suburbs. Yesterday, I quoted a couple of figures that are reasonably representative, I think, of that small accommodation providers as a whole, where their revenue for the financial year is down more than 40%. as is their occupancy sitting around that 40% level too, and their room rates have dropped as well. So they're on a pretty grim sort of holding pattern, which in monetary terms, so to give you another example, the break-even point for this one particular smallish provider is about $1,400 a day. During the lockdowns, they weren't making that for a 2-week period. So they're pretty stark numbers. The most effective thing we can do now is what we're doing is to suspend that rate, but also I think to signal, we've signalled it though it's not immediately apparent in the resolution, that there be some sort of review or analysis of how this rate is operated. And I should say in passing that these accommodation providers do appreciate the input of Auckland Unlimited, who have been supportive of them. So I think that's useful to put on the table, Madam Chair, that they appreciate the relationship that is developed with Auckland Unlimited and their empathy with their position. As far as our position goes, looking forward to July, or in advance of July it will be, we really do need to examine some of the key features of this rate, which haven't changed since it was introduced. And, that goes to the basis of capital value. That doesn't even capture the number of people that are staying in any given hotel or motel. I think it also needs to go to the notion of benefit. So not only do they contest the idea that it's a fair representation of those who benefit, and it's just zeroing on them. Outside of that, geographically speaking, there's a very real issue of very little or no benefit coming to people outside of certain parts of Auckland. And while some were exempted, others weren't. So in many ways, it's flawed, and certainly listening to the people that are involved at the coalface, they say it's flawed. So if we do take this time between now and July to examine some of those issues, then I think that's going to be a productive use of time. And I would just say in concluding, Madam Chair, to talk about not saying anything while the court case is in progress. I certainly no intention of doing that. But another nice effect of that might be a lessening or a removal of the very substantial legal bills that have been run up thus far with that court case. Apparently 1.2 million for the initial court case and an indeterminate amount for the appeal that's going on now. They are no small sums of money at the moment that are in essence arise out of those issues that I highlighted there. So I will heartily support these recommendations, as I'm sure everyone else would, and I think that'll be another good news stories to go to our accommodation providers in the interim. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillors wishing to... Sorry, Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to speak in favour of the motion, while acknowledging that the commercial accommodation sector has that relationship with Auckland Unlimited, which sounds like it's healthy and good. That's terrific. I probably don't see any perceived stalling because we're deferring this collection for the sector. They're big people, organised companies. They can promote themselves well enough, I think, without us having to come to the party. And I wish them well on that. We've also got to realise that the perception of Auckland, probably overseas, as a COVID centre in New Zealand. And if we want to bring tourists into New Zealand, they probably need to be being targeted at places where people feel least at risk. But I think we'll leave that up to the private sector to determine how they best promote themselves. So just speaking in support of the motion, Madam Chair, and I think it's the correct thing also to be aligning with the financial year in terms of the rating system. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And final comment? No, not final comment. Your Worship.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Look, I absolutely support the recommendation proposed here and note the support from officers from within Auckland Council and also from Auckland Unlimited. Over the last year has been a a really black year for the whole of our tourist industry. We all understand the reasons for that. And, you know, I'm the first to say that when an industry is suffering the losses that our accommodation and tourist industry has, we're there to try to give them a helping hand, and we're doing that by suspending the accommodation provider targeted rate. I do want to say that the impact of COVID's not going to be with us forever. And if we look at it positively, actually, one of the impacts of COVID-19 and how New Zealand has handled it is that this country suddenly becomes more attractive to international tourists. We look like a stable country. People watched the America's Cup. They saw the sunshine. They saw the people gathering because we're not a COVID centre. We've got on top of it each time that it's there, and we've done better than almost any other place in the world. So that will help us. But I do acknowledge Councillor Darby's point that when international tourism resumes, if we're the only city in New Zealand and Australasia, and probably the wider international environment that's not promoting itself, then we might be struggling to get the people back. And I want to make not only that point, that we will need to go out and market ourselves at that point, but also to make the point that we're looking at promoting new events that will also be very expensive to the city. Everybody here would be in favour of the FIFA Women's World Cup, and the fact that we have the opening match and the semi-final opens up an audience to 1.2 billion people, 3 times the amount of the Rugby World Cup. But it's also costing our city, as it is every other city. So we'll be up for $11 million to run that, plus some of the operating costs around it. If we hold on to the defence of the America's Cup, we won't have the infrastructure to build because that's there, but we'll still have to do all that operational work around it. And each one of those events is incredibly good for the accommodation industry. So the FIFA Women's Cup will bring 130,000 bed nights to accommodation providers in Auckland, but we're paying for it. And one reason we brought in the accommodation provider targeted rate was because people around the city were telling me, when the immediate and financial benefit comes to accommodation providers, why are we, the ratepayers, meeting 100% of promoting those events? And I agree with that. And I will oppose and oppose and oppose again any effort to put that whole weight back onto the ratepayer, rather than asking the sector that does the best out of the tens of millions of dollars we spend on events and marketing. They've got to come to the party. They've got to make a share of that when they're in the position to do so. And if we don't do that, we know it's already built into our budget. There'd be a $126 million hole that we would have to meet by increasing rates or cutting other areas of council activity. I think that we do need to promote our city as a tourist place to come to, destination. We need to provide support for Auckland Unlimited, which I think the industry itself would acknowledge has done a really good job. And we need to promote events like the FIFA Cup that will be really good for our city. But what we're asking the industry to do when it's back on its feet is to play its part and to pay its share in that. But I support these recommendations in front of us. It's the best and most obvious way that we can help the industry when they're facing a tough time. When we get through that, we want them to play their part in helping us promote this city and running events.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. Hard act to follow. Look, I am going to support these recommendations, but I did too want to acknowledge Auckland Unlimited and their constrained and continually constrained budgets. They'll be gearing up now to promote Auckland to the world, and they take a holistic approach. They take an Auckland Inc. approach. They don't just take an Auckland Council, these are our facilities approach. And they are doing that on a very limited budget, and we will be hearing from them in the future, and we have already to some degree around the challenges that they are facing around some of our assets as well as operational costs. So I have confidence in Auckland Unlimited, and I would have confidence in them to deliver what is required from this rate if and when it ever gets reinstated. So I just wanted to signal that perhaps we can have a really good think and look about the prioritisation of our budgets as we go forward through the LTP as to what support Auckland Unlimited need to succeed in their role of getting Auckland on the world stage once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Well, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I also support the recommendations. I want to thank Auckland Unlimited, Steve Armitage and Andrew Duncan for their work around this. Look, this debate isn't about the pros and cons of the accommodation provider targeted rate. It's about the consultation that happened and which of the three options we're going to go for. And this is the best option for the accommodation sector in a time that they have found terribly difficult and with the lack of tourists coming to Auckland. So to that end, I'll keep it brief. It's been moved and seconded. Let's put it to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Item 12 is our usual summary of Finance and Performance Committee information, memoranda, briefings and our forward work programme. I will move this. Do I have a seconder? If so, thank you. Councillor Collins. Any questions? Comments? Put it to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. I have no extraordinary business. Now I will move a procedural motion to exclude the public because we are going into confidential. Do I have a seconder for that, Councillor Dalton? Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. We'll take a 5-minute break while we clear the room.